Hello, another top 10 list, did you say? Well, I'm happy to provide. Hey everyone, I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem, and this is my top 10 books that I read in the year 2024. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. I'm a composer, now also a booktuber. You can find my music in The Wheel of Time Season 2, His Dark Materials Season 3, and the newly released psychological horror film Dead Whisper. So I was gonna kind of make this video for the following week, but I figured, hey, who doesn't love a good top 10 list, right? Also, I have to do a little research on my other videos, so I figured this is a good time to slot it in. But this has been a fantastic year in many fronts, you know. Started the BookTube channel, got a chance to interact with so many of you, have gotten a chance to get book recommendations that really kind of changed the trajectory of my reading, and I was able to give book recommendations in turn. It's always nice to have that kind of a dialogue, and now we actually have a Discord channel in the comments where you can have more of a dialogue if you want to. It's 43 strong right now, a lot of people who are book aficionados of different backgrounds, you know, reading backgrounds, and who just love to encourage each other's reading passions. So if you kind of like this video, please like and subscribe. And now on to the list of our top 10. Couple caveats for this before we begin. There's going to be no rereads on this list. And the only reason is, you know, when you reread something, you obviously love it. And love it enough to reread it. And so there's a little bit of bias there. And I want to capture what it feels like to read something for the first time, because that's kind of that visceral gut reaction you have. And that kind of is what I decided to use when I was compiling this top 10 list. The second thing is I'm going to only have one book per author. Honestly, I probably would have put multiple books by my new discovery this year, Ken Follett. And I didn't want to do that because I wanted to leave room for more of a varied list. So let's get on to some honorable mentions. Now, this first honorable mention is one, the only reason it probably didn't make the top 10 is I'm still kind of reading it. I'm only 200 pages left to go. I'm hoping to finish this tomorrow, and that is Brandon Sanderson's Wind and Truth. To say that this was highly anticipated for my own bucket reading list, and of course so many others around the world, is an understatement, right? Everybody's looking forward to the Stormlight Book 5, which concludes the arc of this 10-book series, kind of divided into two parts. So this was the end of part 1 of the series, presumably, and maybe the end of certain character arcs. You know, I don't know. It still remains to be seen. But I have absolutely loved this book. I will say the only thing that kept it off this top 10 list for me so far is I kind of don't know where it's going, and I don't want to jump the gun and put it on a top 10 list. But really, everything that would qualify a top 10 list, it really has. The character growth is like 5 books in one. The lore is so much more deeply explored, and you expect that a book like this would be wrapping up loose ends kind of a book. But it really isn't. It actually deepens the mystery as much as it wraps up stuff. So very fascinating thing. It kind of came as a surprise for me in that respect. And so that is going to be an honorable mention. The second honorable mention, again, this is a book that could go on any top 10 list. And ironically, it is probably the book that when I read it, I enjoyed it. But I keep thinking about it. You know, it's one of the books I've thought most about, and I'm talking about Guy Gavriel Kay, a new discovery on this channel, thanks to Josh from Red Fury Books, who recommended I start with The Lions of Al Rassan. I wish I could put this on the list. I mean, it was fantastic. The character arcs were amazing. The locations, it's kind of set in this like medieval Spain. There's Middle Eastern influences as well. And just Guy Gavriel Kay's writing style is phenomenal. And it's not like self-congratulatory, if that makes sense. The prose is accessible, but it's just beautiful. And so it really does work well with the story and the characters. And I think about that book a lot. So the only reason it's not on this top 10 list is because there's just so many good books I got a chance to read this year. So let's dive into this list proper. At number 10, The Hunger of the Gods, The True Redemption Story by John Gwynne. Book 2 of his Bloodsworn saga. So I've been reading this with John from Disquiet and Dragons, and we both felt that the first book, The Shadow of the Gods, you know, I was highly anticipating it because I've read John Gwynne's Faithful and the Fallen quadrilogy, and then the subsequent Of Blood and Bone trilogy that takes place as a sequel. And I absolutely loved all of them. There's 7 for 7 for me. And so I had big anticipation for this. And I think John, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I know we had read Robin Hobb together. And so he had a really high bar in fantasy, right? So, and I think we both felt like, wasn't connecting with the characters in the way that we had hoped, But Hunger of the Gods fixed all those issues for us because the character growth is phenomenal. Like Orca's character arc, she's just such a badass, and like it's really cool to see how some of the lore really develops. Some of the magic of Faithful and the Fallen I feel like is captured in this in terms of the mystery and the lore, and you really start to care about these characters more. And I also felt that some of the minor characters, this is one thing I love about John Gwynne, by the way, is like some of his minor characters end up being as iconic as some of his major characters, and I feel like the same thing is true here. And Gudvar's, I think I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but his storyline is really captivating to me. So I'm excited to see where book 3 goes. I think I'm gonna be reading that with John later this month, maybe carrying into January. We'll see. But right now, Hunger of the Gods, a true redemption story for both of us. Now, I've been watching Philip Chase, the Dr. Fantasy himself, for years, and I've absolutely loved his Dear Dr. Fantasy segments on his BookTube channel and his kind of philosophical introspection analysis of fantasy. Kind of transcendental fantasy, he calls it. And he has come out with the Edan trilogy, which has stolen my heart this year. Really, far and away, the biggest pleasant surprise of the year for me. And I love The Way of Edan. I thought it was just a fantastic start to a trilogy. And for this being, I believe, Philip Chase's first book, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like a fully formed author, The prose is accessible, but it's absolutely gorgeous. And the characters, there are tropes in it, but they're done in a way that is very tasteful and doesn't feel like you're rehashing the same thing, There's a holy war. It kind of gets you to question, like, what motivations guide people to do great or terrible things. So really fascinating series. Now, the one that I'm putting on this list was The Prophet of Edan. Oh my God, it was even more of a step up, like a quantum leap from The Way of Edan. I just fell in love with the characters in this. Dayraven's story gets even more interesting. The antagonists are that much more kind of visceral and real, and it ends in a way that I didn't expect, and it really makes me excited for book 3, Return to Edan, which I'll be starting as soon as I finish Wind and Truth in like a day or two. So super excited to see how that story concludes. But if you haven't read this series, this trilogy, highly recommend you check it out. I'm leaving the link in the description, as I do with all the books I mentioned here, and I think you'll really enjoy it. If you like classic fantasy, if you like modern fantasy, if you like a combination of the two, this is definitely one to check out. Coming in at number 8 is a sci-fi book. So I read this while I was on a trip to England to visit my grandparents, and I had a lot of time to kind of read and stuff. It's a very small book, but man, does it pack a punch. Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. Now, this is my first Arthur C. Clarke book, but I'd watched 2001: A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick, the 1968 film. Absolutely fell in love with it. It's one of my favorite films of all time. So I wanted to read something by the man. But I didn't want to read 2001: Space Odyssey because I didn't want to immediately start comparing to the film. So I decided to read Childhood's End, which I've heard such great things about. And it explores the idea of, what if humanity could be saved from itself? What would it cost humanity? And man, it goes into some mind-blowing territory. It starts off in like one particular way where you kind of think you know where the story's going, and it takes a hard left turn about a third of the way through. Fantastic book. I mean, it packs really 1,000 pages worth of, kind of evolution, I guess you could say, into this small, handy paperback size. So really, really great book. Highly recommend Childhood's End. Coming at number 8. Number 7, I was talking about this a little bit earlier, but John from Disquiet and Dragons and I have been going through some of these Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, also with Ellie from Bibbidi Bobbidi Books, so I'm also linking down below. Well, on the second entry, Royal Assassin, John and I got a chance to read that one together, and oh my God, like, I liked Assassin's Apprentice enough. It felt like a very neat kind of story, tidy story, but I didn't get the sense of the character arcs and like exploring trauma in a way that only Robin Hobb can do. I feel like not enough has happened to this character Fitz, who's, a big part of this book, in the first book, whereas in the second book, the stakes are so much more raised. You see him going through adolescence. You kind of see his growing pains. You also see some things about the trauma he's kind of dealt with already from the events that take place in the first book. But unlike most books where there's a time skip or something and you kind of, you get to see where the character is now, it's not like that. You really go into it the way he might have gone into it. And man, the way it ends was a mind-blowing ending. So Royal Assassin, Book 2 of the Farseer trilogy, part of Robin Hobb's 16-book epic, The Realm of the Elderlings, is at number 7. Now, number 6 is a complete departure for a list like this, because as you've noticed, I've done a lot of fantasy, a lot of sci-fi, that kind of thing. But this one is actually a memoir. So this one is called Living the Beatles Legend, The Untold Story of Mal Evans. So anyone who knows, half my videos probably have me wearing a Beatles shirt. I'm a number one fan of the Beatles. They're my favorite band of all time. And I was always very amazed at how they evolved in 7 years. Made like 13 studio albums, 4 films, all this stuff. But one thing that was not very explored is Mal Evans, their roadie. Roadie turned co-songwriter on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album. Insane, and not very many people knew some of this stuff. So, you get to see things from a bird's eye view of how the Beatles were as people and as they evolved through Mal Evans' eyes. So really fascinating book. And it's very rare. It's like there's so many books on the Beatles now that it's very rare to find a book with such a treasure trove of new information that people didn't even know about. So this was one of the best Beatles books I've ever read, and I've read quite a few. And it tells the Beatles story in a way that I've never seen before. So highly recommend you check this one out as well. Living the Beatles Legend is number 6 for me. Number 5 is Joe Abercrombie's Best Served Cold. So this is a standalone that comes right after the first trilogy that he did. So there's the first law is divided into 9 books. There's a first trilogy, there's 3 standalones, and there's a sequel trilogy. I've yet to read the sequel trilogy, and I think I have one more standalone to go as well, Red Country. So we'll see how these rank for me ultimately. But right now, Best Served Cold is my favorite first law book. It is a contained story. It explores the nature of revenge, kind of Count of Monte Cristo vibes, but really in a way that only Joe Abercrombie can do. And the idea of like best served cold, revenge is a dish, best served cold. It's kind of in the name, but he explores that through the character of Monza and her quest for revenge in a way that I've never actually seen revenge explored before. And Joe Abercrombie is a master at writing characters that are inherently flawed, some who try to do the right thing, some who are irredeemable. And this book is really just a wonderful story, perfectly paced. I felt like out of all the books of Joe Abercrombie's I've read so far, I've read 5. It was the most perfectly paced novel. It was the perfect fantasy novel to me. And the only reason I didn't put it higher on this list, honestly, was because there were so many other good books this year. But this is definitely at a solid number 5. But in any other year, I'm sure I would have probably put it at number 1. So going to number 4 is now, I've covered some fantasy, I've covered some sci-fi. This is sci-fantasy. And it is Christopher Ruocchio's Sun Eater, Book 6, Disqui Gods. So I've been reading these books, kind of, so the last few entries, I think, as they've been coming out. And Hadrian Marlowe's story is just absolutely captivating. It's set 20,000 years in humanity's future, and it poses the question of, like, what if an Anakin Skywalker type character becoming a Darth Vader was for the good of mankind, for the good of humankind? And it goes from there, and you kind of get to see his story from his point of view. Is he a reliable narrator? Is he an unreliable narrator? Who can tell? But we're seeing it through his eyes. And I thought that Demon in White, the 3rd book, was my favorite. Maybe Kingdoms of Death, the 4th book. But he just blew those out of the water, in my opinion, with Disqui Gods. This is absolutely my favorite Sun Eater book now. It just goes into weird eldritch territory. It's definitely one that when book 7 comes out, I'm going to read again, because I could just already see there's so much nuggets of information that I don't think I could have possibly digested. Like, I feel like my brain literally expanded from reading that book. And Hadrian's story, after the events of book 5, not going to spoil anything, of course, but you kind of wonder where things are going to go from here story-wise. And it picks up, kind of sometime after the events of book 5, and you kind of see this new arc begin in Hadrian's story that's going to lead us to the conclusion. So it was a setup book, but it also expands the world and the lore so much more that you're kind of, again, left wondering. It's kind of like Wind and Truth, but like as a setup book, you're left wondering, where are we going to go from here? We know kind of how the story ends because we found that out in the very beginning of the first book, but how will it end, you know? What's the process of getting there? So I'm excited to see kind of where these threads are going to finally resolve. But Disqui Gods, phenomenal book. Christopher Rock is like one of my favorite all-time writers now. His prose is incredible, his character exploration, and him, like Robin Hobb, is really good at analyzing grief, really good at analyzing what someone goes through and how it affects them. You think about Hadrian Marlowe as like, he's a traveler through time, hundreds of years through time, because they can, you know, cryogenically freeze themselves for decades, right? So yeah, there's an isolation that comes with that, and you really feel his plight throughout the course of the series. And this book really takes it to a head. So anyways, I'm gushing about this book because it's just phenomenal. So you got to check it out if you haven't checked out the Sunny Eater series, and I promise you you'll enjoy it. You know, satisfaction guaranteed. So number 3, we are at the top 3. So this was a very tough list to make. Ultimately, all 3 of these ended up being chonkers, and I guess I just love chonkers. What can I say? But coming in at number 3 was my boy Stephen King. Of course, you know I have a whole shelf dedicated to the man back here. He's my favorite author of all time, and I read a few books of his this year. I think I read like 8 because I've been trying to read one a month. And of course I didn't reach that all, but I was trying to at least read one a month. Oh, hey Pepper. Hey Pepper. Oh my God, Pepper. She's like a mountain goat. But so so coming in at number 3, sorry for that interruption, is Under the Dome by Stephen King. So this one was a chonker. A lot of people said, you know, it's not his best work and stuff like that. But I gotta say, I disagree. It was a phenomenal masterwork in my opinion. There are certain things that he did in his book Needful Things, where he kind of has this town and you get to know the whole town, and there's like 50 characters, right? He kind of perfected that storytelling device in this book, in my opinion. So basically what Under the Dome is about is, let's say that you're a town minding your own business, small town, and suddenly a glass dome appears out of nowhere, sealing the town in. How long would it take for humanity, people living in that town, you know, for morals to start to dissolve, for people to try to use this for political or personal gain, to bring out the best and the worst character traits in people? It's really an analysis of characters. And my favorite thing about Stephen King is like about the evil that people do to each other rather than just the supernatural horror. So that the dome part feels supernatural almost, or maybe like a conspiracy or something, right? But that part is just kind of a device to get us to those characters. And man, Stephen King did it again. Like, he has all these characters, you get to know every single one of them by the end of it. And to me, I didn't feel like there was a slow moment in the book. I felt like it was perfectly paced. That's my opinion, you know. But I really feel like that book was one of the better Stephen King books in recent memory I've read, and it's one of his more recent ones too. I can't quite remember when it came out, but it came out I think in the 2000s. So one of his more recent books. And love how I'm saying like 20 years ago is like recent, but you get the idea. But Under the Dome by Stephen King is clocking in at number 3 for me. Now we're down to the top 2. So I had mentioned Ken Follett was a new discovery for me this year. I have gotten turned on to historical fiction, and it's a new genre I haven't really explored very much. I haven't explored it with intentionality, let's put it that way. And so I decided to try some Ken Follett, but I didn't want to just read Pillars of the Earth as the first one to go to. I know a lot of people say that's the best place to start. That is his most famous book and probably one of the most popular books in the 20th century. But I actually was fascinated by the idea of 100 years of world history explored through 3 novels and 5 families and multiple generations across those novels. And I'm talking about the Century Trilogy. So if I had to pick one of the 2 I've read so far, which was Fall of Giants and Winter of the World, it's hard to say because both are fantastic. So Fall of Giants takes place around World War I, the women's suffrage movement, and the Russian Revolution. And I'm a sucker for World War II history as well, and Winter of the World is about that. So it was hard to decide, but I think if I had to choose, it would be The Fall of Giants by Ken Follett, book 1 of his Century Trilogy. So This one is about those 5 families. You get to kind of see the origin story of these 5 families as they make their way through those 3 events that I mentioned, the World War I, the women's suffrage movement, and the Russian Revolution. And his character work in this is just unbelievable. I mean, he is a thriller writer by trade. So he wrote a bunch of thriller novels before diving into historical fiction. So he knows how to perfectly pace and plot books in a way that feels exciting. And this book is like almost 1,000 pages. I think it's like 900 and some change. And it is riveting throughout. And, you know, honestly, I will say World War I is not like the most interesting to me historically, but I was riveted on every page of this book. I felt like I cared about every single character, even the ones that I hated or loved to hate or I hated to love. I really felt justified in my hatred or love for those characters. And there were ones where I would be rooting for. And when they would succeed at something, I would literally start cheering while reading it, which never happens to me. I'm not like a very emotional, physically emotional person when I'm reading. Like I won't cry when I'm reading or like, you know, stuff like that. But I mean, this one was just like, I was just like in, you know, and I just love Ken Follett's portrayal of women in this book. I felt like they had some fantastic like female badass characters in it. And I really loved seeing that in the context of a time when, you know, the women's suffrage movement is going on. Women are not treated with the same degree of equality in those days. And so it was really cool to see some of these characters buck the trend and really kind of just show their badassery. So that was one of the many reasons why Ken Follett's The Fall of Giants is number 2. So that leaves the number 1 pick. Now, what could it possibly be? Well, as I mentioned, I've been reading a lot of chonkers this year. One was a 1,300-page book, and it actually ignited my love of historical fiction. It is the book that made me go, I need to explore Ken Follett. I need to explore all this other stuff. I need to explore Guy Gavriel Kay, and I need to get to know more historical fiction as a genre. I'm talking about the one that had a show come out on FX this year, and that is Shogun, Book 1 of the Asian Saga by James Clavell. Now, this book is like 1,300 pages in hardcover, font that's like this, and I gotta say, I absolutely didn't feel like there was a dull moment in the book. It is very interesting, though, because this book, you know how usually you'll see structures of books where there's like a big, banging start, and then in the middle, maybe kind of goes down a little bit, and there's like a little bit of a denouement set up to kind of this big, epic, climactic finish. I felt like the book was smooth sailing all the way through. It was just, for me, it was high moments all the way through. And it was high moments not by what happened, but just living with the characters. Because if you don't know what the book is about, it's the year 1600, and an English officer on a Dutch naval ship crash lands in Japan. Could you imagine this? This is based on real history, too. There is this kind of East meets West, fish out of water type of a story where suddenly they have crash landed. They have never met the Japanese before. Japanese have met very few Westerners as well. And you're seeing the clash of like medieval Japan and the samurai culture and the West. And it is fascinating. I mean, you're seeing half this book through a translator because, of course, they don't speak each other's language. But there is a translator there who's able to relay some of that stuff. So you're learning Japanese as you read it. And character work is just explored in such depth and detail. It's like day by day you're living in this new world for Blackthorn. So really, really fascinating. And I felt like, you know, some people love the ending, some people don't like it. I personally loved it because I feel like the book is not, without spoiling anything, the book is not about certain events that you expect it to be about. It's really about the journey these characters make as they crash land here, are forced to live here, and learn the Japanese way of medieval Japan at that time. And it just stole my heart. I mean, I really this is another one where I think about the characters a lot. And I also, you know, I'll find myself like thinking about like, oh, I would love to learn Japanese someday. And it's interesting because this is the book that apparently made people in the US, when it came out, I think 1975, made people in the US want to learn Japanese and be fascinated by Japanese culture. So not only was it my favorite book of the year, but it was a cultural touchstone where it actually changed the West's perception of Japan. I mean, that's kind of fascinating in itself, you know, that it could have such a cultural influence. So that is my number one, Shogun by James Clavell. So what did you all think of this list? Did you see any surprises? Anything that you expected to see? Anything that you didn't expect to see? Would you reorder this list? Let me know in the comments. If you have a top 10 list for this year, please drop it in the comments as well, because like I always love to make this a dialogue. That's my favorite part of this channel and of the Discord and everything that we get a chance to do together is like get to recommend more books to each other, because like we don't have insanely impossible TBRs as it is, right? Of course not. Yeah. What am I thinking, you know? But that's it from me. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. Thank you so much again for watching, and I'm leaving a link to another video here if you want to check it out. This one is kind of my top 10 standalones that I want to read in 2025. So if you want to kind of get a jump on the year and see kind of what I'm up to, and if you want to join on some of those, you can join. Let me know in the comments, or you can join on the Discord as well. So with that, be good to yourselves, be good to each other. Thank you for bearing with my rambling here for almost 30 minutes, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.